But all of which we've spoken applies to the Jewish community from some time before the 12th century, though we know not exactly from which point, exactly how far back communities of Jews go in China, but from the 12th century at least through the 18th century to some degree. By the 19th century, the community is a goner. The last rabbi, himself quite ignorant of the religion, has passed away without successor, and now there is not a single member of the community left, so far as we know, who is even able to read Hebrew. Never mind understand Hebrew. There is no one left who can even vaguely pronounce the characters. The members of the Jewish community find themselves indigent in the extreme, and for want of ability to repair the structure, the synagogue complex crumbles into oblivion. As well, a great many of their sacred texts somehow find their way into the hands of Christian missionaries under somewhat murky circumstances. And the memory of any Jewish identity in Kaifeng can perhaps best be compared to rumors of mist vanishing in the face of a rising sun. All of which I would say, though, is to be expected. The extraordinary thing about this community is not the fact that eventually they dissolved, but rather the fact that they survived for so long, this Am Kashei Oref. The fact that they eventually assimilated could only be expected given their circumstances, which was a small Jewish community to begin with, so far as we know, with few close neighboring communities, and even what ties they had with the larger Jewish world had been abruptly cut off when around the start of the 1500s, the Ming emperors severely restricted travel between their domain and the world beyond, thus drying up whatever source of Judaic nourishment the old Silk Route had provided. And thus, with all the mahjong cards stacked against them, they assimilated as individuals in all different directions, with some members of the community almost certainly becoming Christians, though we have no clear baptismal records proving the conversion of any number of Jews to Christianity. We do know that when Kaifeng Jews first encountered the Jesuits, not being able to imagine the exceedingly unlikely possibility of the independent growth of a religion based in their own sacred texts that was not Judaism. Of course, Islam to some degree is based in Judaism, but Christianity actually accepts the Bible as the basis of their religion. Many Jews erroneously therefore believed that these Jesuits were actually their co-religionists from a distant land. Not disabusing them of this notion, there is evidence of some Christian missionaries taking advantage of this naivete on behalf of the city's Jews, and we find mentions of some of Kaifeng's most religious youth being sent to study under the Jesuit missionaries. In fact, proof of this miscomprehension on behalf of the Jewish community in Kaifeng can perhaps best be found in a letter received by the aging Matteo Ricci, actually perhaps not aging, but shortly before his death, where the reigning rabbi in Kaifeng offers Dr. Ricci the rabbinate of the city after his own passing, though he did make this offer only on two conditions. A, it was conditional upon Mr. Ricci giving up upon this ridiculous notion that he apparently had that the Messiah had already arrived. The rabbi says, of course we know the Messiah will not arrive for 10,000 years. In case you're confused, by the way, of any mention of 10,000 years, being as that does not seem to come from too many Jewish texts, you should know that in China at the time, emperors were praised and blessed to live for 10,000 years, which essentially meant a grand old time. And as well, even in modern times, communist leaders are praised by the adoring adulation of the throngs of masses before them to live for 10,000 years. It is a sort of long live the queen, if you will. In other words, the rabbi's point of view was that the Messiah's arrival is way off in the distant future, which is very interesting, by the way, because it's not a point of view that you find very common in other Jewish communities, perhaps because other Jewish communities really needed the Messiah, whereas in China, they were doing pretty good. In any event, as well, the rabbi writes to Dr. Ricci that it's come to his attention that Dr. Ricci was apparently somewhat lax in his observance of some of the kashrut laws, some of the kosher laws, and that, in fact, he had been seen eating pig. And the rabbi told Dr. Ricci that before any offer can actually be tendered regarding his taking over the rabbinate in Kaifeng, he had first to forswear ever eating of pig again. In any event, Matteo, or Li Madao, as he was locally known, died a short while later and did not accept the position of chief rabbi of Kaifeng, but the very fact that it was offered by the most Judaically knowledgeable member of Kaifeng's community was somewhat perhaps the greatest proof of the Kaifeng's community mistaken notion that Christians were Jews, an erroneous perception that obviously can be taken advantage of by the unscrupulous, a class of people who are always found everywhere. As well, you'll recall that to the Chinese, the Jews and Muslims were almost indistinguishable, and thus often referred to the Jews simply as the blue-capped Muslims. And the evidence seems to indicate that with the passing of the later years, some Jews themselves began to see the lines as rather blurred between themselves and the Mohammedans, and likely melted into the local Islamic community. And perhaps the majority of those who assimilated out of the community likely mixed into the general Chinese population, something easy to do and very tempting to do in an enlightened land with impressive intellectual achievements and a wonderful tolerance for your people, the lack of which things may have ironically contributed to the survival of the Jewish people in various Islamic and European lands during the Middle Ages, known also for above reasons as the Dark Ages. China's meritocratic system, on the other hand, of allowing even the most humble, or many of the most humble, to attain high rank through the passing of various governmental exams, meant that a great many Jewish youth must have spent the bulk of their formative years in the study of Confucian doctrine and Chinese practice at the undoubted expense of time that would have otherwise perhaps have been spent in the study of their Hebraic heritage and knowledge. In fact, we happen to know of a number of Jews from this community who achieved the highest Chinese ranks, including that of Jinshi, amazingly enough, when oftentimes only one out of hundreds of candidates for the position would actually pass, and it would seem that the Jews succeeded in a higher proportion than their meager numbers would recommend. But as successes or not, it usually did little for the overall Judaism quotient of the city. In fact, those few geniuses who made up the tiny percentage of applicants to actually pass the highest exams often received employment as officials, administrators, or governors in lands distant from Kaifeng, with the result being that the best and the brightest were often lost as assets to the community as a whole. As well, various disasters, floods, fires, and sieges must have taken more than a few lives, as well as having drained the resources of the community and their ability to keep rebuilding their shul, which, by the way, they did rebuild in part or in total at least 10 times that we're aware of. But despite the fact that the shul was rebuilt again after the great flooding of the Yellow River in 1642, that siege and subsequent flood should not be underestimated in accounting for the eventual dissolution of the community. First of all, because many were killed. A great many people in Kaifeng, and we can assume of the Jewish community in Kaifeng as well, were killed. And as well, many of the documents and other religious articles were swept away or otherwise destroyed beyond repair. And in the aftermath of the flood, many survivors dispersed to other areas. And this disaster, the siege and subsequent flood, even more than prior disasters, seems to have broken up the chain of continuity of learning within the community, as people were struggling to survive and had far less ability to sit at the feet of Morenu Rabbenu, as the rabbis of the community were called. And with the 19th century's political upheavals, many of the city's Jews fled the city, particularly in the aftermath of a Muslim rebellion, when some of the city's Jews, fearful of being mistakenly grouped with the Muslims and being viciously punished on account of them, scratched their names off of the stele to the best of their ability, so that they would not be identified as members of what was considered a subgroup of Islam. And thereafter they did their best to hide their Jewish identity in all ways.